I want to welcome everybody for joining us today. We're going to learn the basics. You can't have a garden, nothing will grow if your soil isn't healthy. So we're getting right down to the dirt here and going to get everything going. I wanted to make a couple of little announcements. Marlis is going to do the presentation next month, and we're going to be doing mason beehives. I think some of you might have been here years ago when we did that. Mason bees are a native bee, and they're an early bee. So we're going to make mason bee houses at the exact right time to put them out so that they will be pollinating all of the fruit trees around, so we'll have healthy fruit in the fall. And the one thing that we're going to need, maybe I'll just let Marlis talk about it.
Okay, we're going to make our, I've been collecting. We're going to make our bee houses in cans. So this is about the right size can. It should be about 3 inches across, and it should not be full of food, obviously. But this is a pineapple can, and that's a good size, or a baked bean can would be a good size, but they're pretty long. You know, they're much taller than this. So this is a good size. So you need to bring this with you, the can, and some kind of sticks. I went out, this is a cattail, and they are non-hollow. But the research says that the bees will hollow them out and use them. These are hollow, and this is, what's the name of the grass?
Phragmites.
Okay, anyway, you find these in wet areas along the edges of swamps and so on, and these stems are beautifully hollow. So if you want to go drive around in the country and see if you can find some of these, you'll need enough cut. You don't have to cut them in advance, but you can. The height of the can, and they have, whatever we're putting in this can has to really be stuffed in. If you don't have any of these or don't get the opportunity to go collect them, you can also use brown paper bags. I'm talking grocery bags, not the real flimsy kind. And we will cut them into strips, roll them around pencils, and then stuff them into the cans. Now, I live in the country. I have trees all around my yard except on one side. And when the wind blows in there, it pulled every single tube I had in there out and scattered them all over the yard, even though I had them stuffed in. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a better deal if you can find these. Then you will need pencils to roll your paper around. Parchment paper is another possibility, like what you bake with. And a tape or a glue stick and scissors. So you'll need scissors to cut these or to cut the strips of paper that you're going to put inside. So I'll go through the list one more time. You need a tin can. You will need a screw, but you don't have to bring that with you because we're going to poke a hole in the bottom of the can. The screw goes in there, and then you can screw that into wood. And then you fill it up with all these tubes. So tin can, some kind of either sticks, hollow grass stems, bamboo, if you can find it small enough. And if you're not going to use that, then brown paper bags or parchment paper. And you'll need pencils to roll the paper around, scissors to cut the paper with, and tape or a glue stick to tape it so that you can stick them into the can without them unrolling. Okay, any questions about that? I will include this in our email as to what your list is. Yes.
Where do we put it?
I'll talk about that in the presentation. No, it will not be in the ground. It'll be hanging. Yeah.
Mine's on too.
There are other ways you can make these too, but just so that everybody's the same, we're going to make them in cans, and I'll talk about the other ways that you can make them. Okay, any other questions?
Is this the same? Yeah, I have a question. Is this the same that Sarah Brandt's going to do like next week?
What?
Sarah Brandt is doing a presentation here.
Oh, I got here at the library, that presentation is making bee.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, it's gonna be like a flower pot with a saucer on top of it and rocks in it to put out in your yard so the pollinators have somewhere to get water.
Okay.
So that's in the same vein. We want to do both of them for our garden, not the same thing. That was a good reminder for everybody.
Yeah, and my class will be the second Tuesday of April, I think it's the 9th. So just like all of our other seed library classes, yes.
What is the name of the bee again?
Mason bee,
Mason bee.
yeah, M-A-S-O-N.
Like a little fly.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't be too panicky if you don't have reeds because the brown paper works great. And if you can't find any paper bags, which are few and far between these days, we'll have some supplies here too. So don't panic. But the thing is, the cans, we probably will not have a whole lot of extra cans, so at least bring your cans. I think that it'll be a fun session. This session is going to be great, right?
No pressure, I guess.
Great. And I'm so happy to introduce Kent. He's gonna tell you all about himself, but he is the soil guy for the state of South Dakota. If you did not pick up one of the little brochures, we've got plenty for everybody, so make sure you pick one of those up. And Kent, take it away.
Okay. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Like the introduction, my name is Kent Vlieger. I'm the state soil health specialist for South Dakota, and I work with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is an agency within the USDA. So technically a federal employee, not a state employee. So a little bit about myself. I mostly grew up in South Dakota. I was born in southwest Minnesota, but I don't even remember living there. My father worked for the Soil Conservation Service, which is kind of the predecessor, kind of the same thing as the agency I work for now, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we moved around a little bit my first few years. I was born in Lakefield, Minnesota. Then we moved to Redfield, South Dakota, and then Mitchell, which is pretty much where I call home. So I grew up in the Mitchell area for the most part. So graduated from Mitchell High School, went to South Dakota State University. After that, I kind of followed my father's footsteps and I joined the NRCS, and I went to North Dakota and worked there for 5 years in a couple of different field offices from the Canadian border to south of Jamestown. So yes, it is colder in North Dakota in the winter. So we like to think we're South Dakota hardy, but it's much colder, especially as you get up towards Canada. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk soil health and gardening, or kind of the more urban landscape, or if you can call anything in South Dakota urban. So what I'm going to start off with is a couple of demonstrations. And I mostly work with our traditional row crop farmers and ranchers throughout the state. And so that's obviously a much larger landscape and much larger management decisions that they're having to make for their operations or for their businesses. But the principles I'm going to talk about today apply whether you are managing 5,000 acres or 50 square feet. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So these demonstrations I run all across the state. I run them for our farmers and ranchers. And I have 2 demonstrations. One is basically it's a mini rainfall simulator. So it's been several years. I think it was probably 5 years ago I ran our larger rainfall simulator here at this exact same library. And if I would have known we were going to have such beautiful weather, I could have almost ran that for you today. But we've got tabletop demonstrations, and we've got tabletop rainfall simulator, and we've got these basically plastic test tubes that you would see in a lot of high school science labs, but they're filled with water, and this is a test that's called the slate test that I'm going to run for you. And I'll explain what we're doing and why we're looking at it as we run through these. So these 2, what we call cutters, basically containers, is something that I take out onto onto the landscape. And this time of year, I can almost push them into the ground. Sometimes I have to kind of set a 2x4 in and tap them in. So I tap them into the soil profile, and I take a spade and I kind of prop them up a little bit, and I clean the bottom off, and I set them on these slotted grates here. So it's really just a soil. It's probably maybe a little over 4 inches deep. And what I do is I collect them on different types of management. So these two here are actually from the community garden in Huron that I helped organize behind my church. And so this is from the plot that I manage, which you're going to see quite a bit of here during the presentation. So this is on my garden plot, which is it's large. It's about 75 feet by 100 feet. And then this is from one of the community plots that are literally feet away from where mine is. And so the difference is that mine is managed 100% no-till, have quite a diverse crop rotation throughout the garden. Practice cover crops pretty much everywhere on the garden whenever possible. This side of the fence is, I would say, is managed like a traditional garden. It is rototilled usually in the spring. Not a lot of plant diversity, usually pretty heavy on the tomatoes and the beans, and not a lot else grown in there. But there's a lot of tillage that takes place on this side of the fence. And as you can see, there's very little ground cover that's on this side of the garden plot. And mine is, as you're going to see in the presentation, is pretty much covered 100% just about all year round. So what we do is we take these two jars, and the level I've got these jars in, when I pour it into these containers, which are perforated on the bottom, it's just going to simulate our kind of a short but intense rainfall event. And so this will be the equivalent of a 1-inch rain. So just think about those summertime thunderstorms we have in South Dakota. This would be just like a 1-inch event. Anything that comes in here is obviously runoff from the surface. So we as gardeners, do we want to see runoff? We don't. Why don't we want to see runoff? There's a couple of reasons. Why? Give me one reason we wouldn't want to see runoff.
Because your seeds go.
Okay, it could wash your seeds away. Erosion, right? Okay, and the other thing is, if we're running off, we're not infiltrating. If we're not infiltrating, we're kind of starving our plants, or we have to provide supplemental water later on. Anything that accumulates in the bottom here is infiltration. So this is what goes into the soil profile, keeps our soils moist, allows our plants to stay healthy, allows the soil biology to remain active as well. So I'll pour these in, and you can just watch what happens. Okay, good, so it worked. First rule of thumb when you're presenting is don't use new materials or new supplies for a first presentation. I broke that rule today because I just collected these yesterday. So, yeah, so these have been sitting there all winter. This is still the ground cover on my side. This one's side of the fence, and it hasn't even been tilled yet this year. So, quite a stark difference, I think we would all agree. Okay, so we've got this side ran off, I would say probably 90% or better. Infiltrated, 90% ran off. Little runoff. Okay, so make the argument, oh, well, your side still ran off. It did. But I think we would all agree if we got a 1-inch thunderstorm that can't get that, it's almost impossible, right? That'd be 1 inch in about 30 seconds. That doesn't happen even in our heaviest rainfall events. So our soils, when we manage them well, are really able to take extreme weather events. I do a larger demonstration where I take some native rangeland or native prairie that's really well managed with livestock. And it's on larger trays, and we put a lot more water on just as fast. It can pretty much take that water as fast as I want to put it on there just about all day long. Literally, I could stand there with the hose and just takes it in. The only thing that would limit it is in the real world, it would reach its saturation point at some point. So that's the difference between the two. Runoff, not so much runoff. What do you notice about the runoff differences between the two? Hey, yep. One of the side is, this side, the water's pretty cloudy. This side, you could probably drink that and be okay. Right? And so when we are getting runoff, even on a small scale, so if we can have runoff
It's good to see you.
on something that is roughly 4 inches by 8 inches, you can have runoff on a garden that's only 100 square feet. Okay, the slope on this is only 2%, that is not very much, that's kind of South Dakota flat. So yeah, we can get runoff, you can have erosion on very small scales, even in your garden area or in your lawn or your home landscape. This looks really bad, that's pretty dirty water, pretty cloudy. If we were to measure the erosion that took place on there, how much do you think that would be in inches? It would be a fraction of an inch, right? Almost imperceptible, really imperceptible to the human eye. But if that happens every time it rains, year after year after year after year, that's where we start to see that noticeable difference. That's where you can actually lose inches over the course of decades. And the same thing happens on our larger landscape. It can happen on your smaller landscape as well. Okay, so that is the rainfall demonstration. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to hand around these 2 cloths. These cloths, actually, I have a supply of these. I collected these last fall. These are not taken from the garden area, but these are taken from row crop agriculture. That would be south of Huron. Similar situation. I collect them literally right across the fence from each other. Okay, this side of the fence is managed differently than this side of the fence. All right, I'm going to pass these around, and what I want you to do is just take a quick look at them, pass them to your neighbor, make note of any differences that you might see. Okay, well, those are going on. I'm going to tell you the difference between each side of the fence. One side of the fence is managed pretty similarly to a lot of our cropland fields throughout South Dakota. It's a corn soybean rotation, which is the bulk of our crop rotation, especially on the eastern half of the state. And that corn soybean rotation has tillage after both crops, after the soybean and after the corn, usually in the fall, sometimes in the spring, depending on what type of weather we have in the spring. I did see people actually out in the field with their discs on my way down, just by the Parkston area. So that is one side of the fence. Both sides of the fence are managed by what I would call successful farming operations. Multi-generational, they're doing well for themselves. So yeah, I would consider them both successful financially as far as what we have for farming operations. Okay, that's one side of the fence, corn, soybean with tillage, usually after harvest and sometimes preceding planting in the spring. The other side of the fence, operated by another family, multi-generational as well. They have practiced no-till agriculture for going on 30 years. It'll be 30 years in 2025, so it'll be next year for them. They practice a crop rotation of corn, soybean, and 2 years of small grains. So the small grains can be spring wheat, winter wheat, or oats usually. And after the small grains, they plant a cover crop. So small grain harvest usually takes place in the Huron area. It can be late July to early August. And then immediately after harvest, they would go and plant a cover crop. That cover crop is then grazed come fall. So once that cover crop is allowed to mature and get some growth on it, they go in there and graze livestock on there. Usually towards the beginning of November. Depending on the year, it can be late October or late November. The interesting thing is that these producers actually don't own livestock. So, am I a liar? Am I making things up? No, so what they do is they rent their cropland acres with cover crop to a neighbor that does have livestock. So it's a good situation for both. The producer with livestock gets to rent that ground at a, what I call a very fair price. Basically, they're charged for the cost of the cover crop seed per acre and then some operational costs for planting. They're really pretty cheap for some really high quality feed. And then that producer gets to keep their livestock out of the feedlot well into the winter. This year they were grazing well into February as they rotated around to the field with cover crops on it. So it saves money for the livestock producer, and then the crops, on the crop producer that owns the land and operates it for crops, they get the benefit of having livestock on the land. What is the benefit of having livestock on the land? Okay, their manure and their urine are basically they're cycling those nutrients in the cover crop. that make it more quickly available for their crop the following year and the years to come, and it's building organic matter. Okay, so those clouds have made their way most of the way around the room. What are a couple of the differences that you've noticed between the two clouds?
Dark and light.
Okay, one is darker than the other.
More porous.
What, one has more pore space in it, more porous. Great.
You can see the roots or something.
Okay, one, you can actually see some of the roots growing through it. Correct. Okay, so we've identified some of the key differences. So which side of the fence is which? Okay, how about the darker side, the darker one? Which side of the fence is that? Okay, the no-till, the high crop diversity and cover crops, right? So we pegged that. Even if you knew nothing really about soils or agriculture, you could probably intuitively guess which side was correct. Okay, so these are the same two fields with different clods. And what we do is we take these, we set them in water. These are both air dry. These have been sitting basically in a storage garage since last fall. I'll be collecting samples here again this spring because my supply is starting to run low. And what we do is we put these in here. And really the way to think about this is it's just like a stress test. So sometimes you take a stress test with your doctor and maybe they put you on a treadmill or a bike and they tell you to walk as far as you can or as fast as you can or pedal as fast as you can. And then you basically are testing your heart and your cardiovascular system. This is like a stress test on the soil. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set these in here and you'll just make notice of the difference between the two. Okay, so they're both dissolving, but which one is dissolving at a slightly faster rate? Okay, they're both going pretty fast. There's a difference though. So even if they are going at the same rate, what's the difference between the clouds on this side and the clouds on this side? You notice the water is a little more cloudy on this side? Okay, so the dissolving is fine. But what we're looking for is really aggregate stability. So what aggregate stability is when you look at soil and it's really high quality and it's kind of crumbly in your hands, it almost looks like black cottage cheese, where it's got kind of those clods of soil that are just like little chunks of cottage cheese. Those are aggregates. And you want to see those in the soil. This soil type here is it's a fine sandy loam, so it does have some sand in it. So as you get towards here on, we start to have a little more sand in the soil. So you're familiar with forestburg, and forestburg grows really great what? Watermelons love growing that sandy soil. So we have sand components that are pretty heavy as you get towards Huron. So they're not quite like, you get down here, kind of the southeastern part of the state, and you have a little more silt in the soil, kind of silty clay. You can get some nice loams. I'm not saying you don't have any sands down here, but little, what a lot of producers would call heavier soil down here. Maybe a little more productive on average throughout most years. And I can really start to see some of the differences between the two, right? So as they get in there and the water really starts to infiltrate, what happens is that water goes into those dry clods as it creates pressure. So think of it like air pressure. If I were to take an empty balloon and blow in there, it starts to expand. The water is doing something similar as it goes into the pore spaces in these clods, creates pressure. The better that soil is able to handle that pressure, the better stability it has, better aggregate stability. So the faster it dissolves, which you can see right here, it's really starting to go. And then this one will eventually stabilize. It'll take all those loose aggregates on the outside and takes those off pretty quickly. And then this one just will break apart very, very slowly. Some aggregates I've had in there for hours and hours, and they just really don't look much different than when I put them in. This one is pretty much 100% dissolved. So why is this side, since they're both dissolving, why is this side cloudy and this side is a lot more clear? What's the difference? It's the same soil type. Sorry?
More washout?
Okay, you're kind of getting there. So what happens when those aggregates break apart? So our soil consists of three main mineral aspects. Nope, nutrients. Those would be the main nutrients, yeah. So what are the three main mineral portions of all soil? They gave you one clue. So forestburg has what type of soil?
Sand.
Okay, so sand is, sand, clay, and silt. Yep, sand, silt, and clay. And if you say sand, silt, and clay, that's basically the order of size of those particles. Sand is the largest particle. You can see an individual piece of sand with the naked eye, like if you're on a beach, you could pick up a piece of sand. Silt is the next size down. Individual pieces of silt are quite small also. If you have a really powerful hand lens, you can maybe see an individual piece of silt. Clay is microscopic. You cannot see an individual piece of clay with the naked eye. You need a powerful microscope to see it. So what happens is when this breaks apart, we're getting that sand, silt, and clay are starting to settle out. So which of those drops the fastest? Sand would, because it's the heaviest and largest, and then the silt, and then the clay. So what you're seeing suspended here from the top down, sand has gone all the way down really rapidly. Silt settles out next, and then the clay can stay suspended for quite a long time because it's very small. And it just takes longer for gravity to essentially pull that to the bottom. Okay, so that's what we see. The reason we do that, when we talk about aggregate stability, is because that aggregate stability only forms in the soil one way. What is holding these particles together that's in greater quantities that is not on this side? Okay, roots is a great guess, and it's a very small portion of it, so I'll give you partial credit, like 10% credit. So yes, roots, so the roots are, someone else said something? Okay, the cover crops, you guys are getting closer. Okay, the roots are very important, and the cover crops which have the roots are very important, and they are crucial to what is taking place with this aggregate stability, but they're not the primary reason. And no-till, you guys are just getting you're kind of just hitting right around the edges, you're getting there.
Organic matter? Looser soil, it's not as compact as the other.
Okay, that's true, but how do we get to that point where it's not as compact? I can take that clod that would look compacted and was dense and turn it into the one that's nice and dark and has lots of pore space and roots growing into it. How do I get it to turn from one side of the fence to the other? All right, I'm not gonna make you live in agony any longer. So we've got the plants, we've got the roots. They're very important. We need those in order to provide energy to the below ground soil biology. Okay, so we've got lots of bacteria, we've got lots of fungal activity in the soil. Okay, usually when we hear fungus and bacteria, we think, yeah, that's bad, we don't want any of that. In the soil, you want lots of it, because most of it is good. So what's holding those aggregates together are basically glyco or glucoproteins. And so basically it's just like sugar protein. And those are produced by the wastes of the bacteria and a lot by fungus, or the fungal spores and the fungal network that's below ground. A lot of the fungus that's in the soil actually associates with plants. So as that plant grows down, it is basically leaking out root juices or root exudates from its photosynthetic activity. So all the plants are nice and green. They're about to green up. I see some green lawns even around the Yankton area. We're not quite that far in Huron yet, but we'll get there. Okay, so that photosynthetic activity is producing energy for that plant. Sun shines down on there. Photosynthetic activity produces energy, and the plant uses that energy to grow. So it grows the above ground portion, which we all see and love and appreciate, but it's also growing the roots below ground. And depending on the type of plant, it can take up to 40% of the energy it's producing through photosynthesis and leak out of its roots those root exudates. So why would a plant want to leak all that energy, up to 40% of its energy, out of its roots? It seems kind of inefficient, doesn't it?
Like their babies, right? For the next generation?
So you're very close. I'll give you a lot of credit for that one. So what it's doing is it's feeding that below ground life. It's feeding the bacteria, it's feeding the fungi. A lot of the fungi that's native to our prairie soils actually associates with those roots. And so it's called, this is a mouthful, it's AMF for short, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And they leave little, think of them as seeds, kind of like little spores below ground. And once they come in contact with the root exudate from a root, they basically germinate like a seed would. And then they essentially burrow into that plant root. And it kind of sounds like a bad thing to start off with, but really what they do is they burrow in there and they send out what's called fungal hyphae, which are just like little microscopic roots that go off from there. So they help that plant to access lots of the soil profile that it cannot access with just its roots. So those fungal hyphae bring back moisture to the plant. They bring back nutrients, especially phosphorus, that the plant was not able to access on its own. And so it's kind of like give and take. That plant gives the fungus, or the bustier mycorrhizal fungi, gives it energy through those root exudates. Then the fungal hyphae bring back nutrients and water to that plant. So it's kind of a give-take. That fungal hyphae has to protect itself from the soil to keep it moist. So think of it like an earthworm. Okay, when you pick an earthworm up from the soil, is it dry and slimy? Slimy. They do that to keep themselves moist. Think of those hyphal networks are doing the same thing. They produce a substance called glomalin. It's not like glue, that's how I remember it, glomalin. And it coats a lot of the particles of our soil, and it acts like a glue to hold them together, and that's how we form aggregates. There you go. That's kind of soil life in a nutshell, and why aggregate stability is really important, and why it's something that soil scientists measure on a regular basis. Okay, so that's soil, that's why we want to protect it.
So we want that one. We don't want the one on the.
You don't want the one that falls apart, correct? Yep. So for the longest time, it was thought that we needed to aerate the soil. We needed to break it up. We needed to loosen it, right? Even our land grant university, that was something they taught for the longest time, is you need to till your soil in order for it to take in the rain. Actually, it's the opposite, because when you till it, you're breaking up those aggregates and destroying them, and then we get this side of the fence as opposed to this one. So actually, too much tillage can prevent rainfall infiltration, because it breaks apart all those aggregates, breaks apart all those pore spaces that make water easily accessible from the soil surface. All right, clear as mud or clear as soil. All right, so that's the importance of maintaining our soils. That's why I'm a big believer in no-till, even in our gardens, and I'm gonna hopefully drive that point home here today. We're gonna talk about the 5 soil health principles. So when I get to this slide on here today, if you remember nothing else from today, but you remember those 5 principles, you'll come out ahead. Okay, so. Perfect. Yep.
Is that right?
Yep, that's perfect. Okay, so I've had this up for a while, so many of you have been able to read it. I think I had a retired teacher here that was very nice and said, nice handwriting. I think that's probably the first time that anyone has ever said that to me. So what you have here is, to give you a backstory, so many of us have moms that save everything. My mom was very loving and she saved lots of things. She came up to me several Christmases ago with a box of stuff and said, hey, this is all yours. And I picked up this cardboard box and it had all sorts of paperwork from the time I was in kindergarten through probably even high school. You know, some stuff with the little sticker on it that said great job, and she had some writing stuff. So I don't even remember writing this, but I did. So for those of you that haven't read it or can't read it from the back, it is pretty faint and my handwriting is not great. So I'll read it for you. So it says, when I grow up, I want to be a soil conservationist. I want to do this because my dad is one, and it sounds like a lot of fun to tell farmers how to get their soil so that it can grow plant better, and how deep to dig wells for their animals. So even if you said my handwriting was great, my grammar was kind of suspect, right? So I believe this is 8-year-old me. That's me at my grandfather's farm. That's me if you can see the picture and you see what I'm doing with my mouth. So that was the days before you could just swipe and get rid of a picture, or just kind of advance the live photo and say make it better. So those are when real pictures were taken. And you'll see here my son maybe is giving me some payback. I'll show you some pictures. Okay, so this isn't about genealogy, so just bear with me here, but these are my great grandparents. They never came to the United States. They were from the Netherlands. If you notice from my last name, Vlieger, I'm very much Dutch. I have a lot of extended family that still lives in the Orange City, Iowa area and in southwest Minnesota. Both sides of the family tree are Dutch. So There you go. So this is great grandparents. This picture is taken roughly in the late 1870s to early 1880s. My great grandfather was a day laborer for most of his life, and then later on was basically think of it as a farm manager for a wealthy landowner, something like that. So the reason I'm showing you this is because of this. So this is a soil profile that you can see, and this is actually a soil profile from the Netherlands. Okay, they have a soil there that is actually still sought after and is highly valued and is very productive cropland, and people will pay high value for it. So kind of a lot like that Northwestern Iowa area, right? They'll pay a lot of money for it. So what I would tell you is the soil is called, depends on where you are in the Netherlands or in Germany, it's called a Pligen or an Enk soil. Name's not necessarily important, I don't expect you to remember that. What I will tell you is that this soil is not natural. This soil is made by centuries of human agriculture. And it's a particular type of agriculture. What I will tell you is, see right around this 80 centimeters, where it turns from black to that kind of orangish yellow. This is the original soil surface from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So how did they take it from this sandy, not very productive lowland soil to something that is very productive? Okay, they did that essentially by following the 5 soil health principles, which we're going to talk about. So the Netherlands was known for they were some of the innovators of stall agriculture. So basically where they had animals housed during the winter in stalls. So they would feed these in a centralized area, mostly dairy cows, other types of livestock as well. So they'd feed them all winter in these stalls, and then spring would roll around. It's time to move the livestock out into pasture. So then what did they do with everything that's left over in the stall? They spread it over their cropland. Okay, so this wasn't the days where they just took a skid steer and loaded, thinking all that was hand loaded back of a wagon and then chucked out in the field. So over decades and centuries, this is basically what happened. So there's a centralized area. Think of the cropland like a pinwheel around that centralized stall area, and they would rotate crops around there. They had quite diverse crops. I've done some research and reading on what the crop production would have been, basically from the 1500s through the late 1800s. So it's quite diverse, lots of vegetables, lots of small grains. They even grew hemp for rope and for clothing. So lots of different things that was grown. Flax was another big crop as well. Okay, so that's why I'm showing you that. So just kind of fun to tie back to family history if you're into that kind of thing. All right, there's my payback. So that's my youngest, that's my son Luke. And we're gonna run through basically how I practice gardening in Huron. And so a little backstory, we've got an area associated with my church that I attend. We have a large, an enormous lot really. It's several acres large. Really all they've done with it is mowed it for quite a long time. And so I like to garden. We have a large immigrant population in Huron, most of them political refugees from the Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand. And they, a lot of them work, Huron's got a large turkey processing plant, and they've also got jack links. But they work there, and there's a lot of low-income housing that surrounds our church just by happenstance. And so we basically started the garden initially to just basically donate this produce to those people. Over time, came to realize that, hey, this is a lot of work for me and my family. We enjoyed it, but it was pretty intense during certain times of the year. So what we did is we kind of downsized what we had, and we opened up plots to the community. And so community members within here basically have a 20-foot by 20-foot garden plot for free with our church as long as they really maintain it. Okay, so that's just a quick history of where my garden is and why we have it. All right, so, show of hands. How many have one of these? It's okay. My parents have it. My dad loves them really short. So, okay, so what I found is doing enough of these talks, both with our traditional row crop producers and our gardeners, is when I say, well, maybe we need to give this up, or maybe you should put this back in the shed and forget it or sell it, I'll regularly get the comment, oh, I love to use my rototiller in the spring or in the fall. It's, something cathartic about it, and I really love the smell of that fresh work soil. Okay, so while I agree, I love the smell of really productive and healthy soil. Do you know that there's actually a name for that smell? That fragrance or that smell is actually identified? Any guesses? Okay, it's called geosmin, so Geosmin. So it just kind of sounds like jasmine, but it's geosmin. And the human nose is actually able to detect it at very, very small amounts in the air. So it's something inherently that we as humans know is good. We can identify these healthy, productive soils. What I will tell you is that get rid of this, and if you really like that smell of fresh work soil, just buy this. This is actually real. It's not made up. It's not a cartoon character. You can actually buy that fragrance of fresh work soil. So, all kidding aside, I'm gonna try and show you why you should, at the very least, minimize how much you till your garden soils. Okay, this is just another reason if you're kind of into the human health aspect of gardening or growing your own healthy produce. This is another reason. So if you're into studies, this is one that I get sent sometimes a lot of studies just from colleagues or friends or people that I run across. But this is a study that was done, and what it does is shows the amount of ergothioneine content in different types of production agriculture. So that ergothioneine, think of that as like an antioxidant that's essential and healthy for humans. But the only way we can get it is from eating plants that have ergothioneine in them. Plants don't produce ergothioneine though. So how does the plant have ergothioneine in it? Because it is associated with fungi in the soil that do produce ergothioneine. And those fungi attach to the plant roots like I described earlier. And then that ergothioneine is then put into the plant. And then we can then eat that plant later on and get that ergothioneine. So it's basically just one of those, think of it as an antioxidant or a vitamin that's in our life that we never really tend to think about. But that ergothioneine content increases or decreases depending on what we do for management. So no-till production has higher amounts of ergothioneine than a moldboard plow, which is quite aggressive tilling. And the reason behind that is every time you till, it breaks up those fungal networks and decreases the amount of fungal activity in the soil. The less you disturb the soil, the more fungal activity you will have in it. Okay, I'd be remiss with my job, my agency, if I didn't tell you that before you do anything or start a new garden, or if you have a new garden that you've had for a long time and you always have certain issues with production, really what you should do is look at our web soil survey. It's an online site. You can go there, you can find anywhere in the nation, in the United States. We are fortunate that we have just about all of our soils mapped throughout the United States. Very few countries have that opportunity or that benefit. So you can go on there, you can draw an area around your whole yard or even just your garden if you want to, and it will tell you the soil type that you have there. So for example, this is Cedar Creek Gardens. This is out by Midland. They grow a lot of produce. And they sell it throughout the state to Lot Rapid City as well. I think they also sell to Mount Rushmore. So if you go there and get a salad, you might be getting it from Cedar Creek Gardens, which is in Midland, South Dakota. So to give you a map, it'll have labels, and then you'll be able to go over to the side and look at what that label means. So this would be an Okoton Lacoma silty clay, 15 to 40% slopes. Unless you're a soil scientist, that probably means very little to you. But what I will tell you is that you can then go and you can click on a whole bunch of different tabs and get all the information you ever want from that soil. So you can have potential water holding capacity, an estimate of what the soil organic matter might be, percentages that it has for sand, silt, and clay. It'll even tell you if it's good for building a foundation on or putting in a septic system. So lots of different things that are there. It will give you potential productivity if you're wanting row crops. We also have some information for like growing grapes and orchards and that kind of things, those kind of things on there. So it'll tell you about if it's a good site for it, or if it has limitations, or if it just says stay away, don't do that there. Web soil survey? I would encourage you to just, if nothing else, just go there and just kind of mess around and see what you can see on
Is that site only for South Dakota?
Nope, it's nationwide. Yep, nationwide, yep. All the lower 48, they're pretty much, they're mostly mapped. They're mapping still, I believe, in Alaska. I think Hawaii should be all mapped, but, yeah, if you're anywhere in the upper Midwest, you'll be able to find your map, your location. Okay, soil health principles. So I spent a lot of time on working with just about every type of land use throughout South Dakota. So our traditional row crop producers, our ranchers, our master gardeners groups, even some landscaping type things, which we'll show a little bit here. We're starting to kind of venture more into the urban conservation with the NRCS, so even that aspect too. Okay, so these are those 5 principles. They will be, if you took either one of those handouts, you will find these 5 principles in there on some page. But these are the 5 principles, and what I've done is we've broken them down into 2 categories or 2 sections for you. The first part you'll see highlighted in orange, the first 2, keep the soil covered and minimize soil disturbance. So we've talked a fair bit about that. We talked about it with this demonstration here. Keep it covered so you don't wash your soil away or blow it away on those windy days. And minimize soil disturbance. We've talked about the many reasons to minimize disturbance. Those are 2 of the parts of soil health that our agency has been involved with for a very long time, basically since the 30s during the Dust Bowl when our agency was formed. So we keep soil covered, minimize soil disturbance. Those are the 2 places to start. So if you're intimidated by adopting all 5 or several of the principles, start with those 2 by keeping the soil covered and minimizing the soil disturbance. I'll show you how I do it, but how you do it may be different. So keep that in mind. As long as you understand the principles, there's lots of different ways to apply them. The next 3 I've highlighted in green. These are kind of the areas that we, especially the past 10 years with a lot of the talk of soil health, have really started to adopt and latch hold to. And that's having plant diversity, having continual live root or live root in the soil as long as possible throughout the growing season, and livestock integration. So I think you can probably picture in your mind's eye how to adopt the first 4, keep the soil covered, minimize disturbance, have good plant diversity or crop rotation is a way to think about that one. Keep a live root in the soil as long as possible. But if you live in the city of Yankton, how do you integrate livestock? That's going to be a trick. That's going to be a tricky one. So we'll talk about how I kind of cheat and do that one within Huron city limits. Some cities in South Dakota will allow you to have poultry, for example. Huron is not one of them. You cannot keep poultry in the city of Huron, which is interesting because a lot of our economy is based off of a turkey farm. So no poultry in Huron. Some cities do allow you to have poultry. I think maybe even the city of Sioux Falls allows you to have a few chickens or something like that. So, but we'll talk about how I cheat and integrate what I call integrate livestock on my garden. So this is that garden area that I talked about. It's the large church building, as you can see. And then behind there is all the garden plots. We'll see if this will show in here at all. It doesn't show very well. You can kind of see the center area. It's almost in the shape of an H. Lots of plots on this side, plots on this side. And that center area is the large plot that my family and I maintain. And then pretty much everything that we donate, pretty much everything that we grow is donated to the community. Really the only stuff that we take home is what goes in my kid's mouth when we're harvesting. So we do take some, but not very much. Okay, so this is the community garden we've started. We have 68 plots right now for the community, and they are filled every year. Most people come back year after year after year to their same plot, which is ideal and easier for us to organize. And we are probably going to expand by maybe another 10, 15 plots this year because demand is there. So really that's, just use that phrase, why mow grass when you can grow food, fiber, and flowers. Really all we did was just mow this. Get someone to mow it every week throughout the summer. And now we're actually having something that's really productive for the community. All right, this is just a diagram of a typical year of what the garden plot that my family and I maintain would look like. Basically break it into 4 sections. So we've got a quarter of the garden area that I have every year goes to a full season cover crop. So just keep that in mind when I start giving you some production numbers. 25% is actually just growing cover crop. We're not harvesting anything from. Another section grows sweet corn and or beans, depending on the year. Another section grows tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, some greens, etc. And then another section is where the melons, squash, pumpkins, flowers are. And then we do have a permanent section with the asparagus and rhubarb. What I also like to point out is surrounding the garden area, we've got basically fruit-bearing shrubs that surround it. So we've got elderberry, plum, hedgerows, aronia berry, and buffalo berry on this side, and then grapes on the east-hand side. So why do we have all those shrubs along the outside of the garden? There's lots of reasons. What do you guys think? Wind control. That's the, to be honest, that's the primary, one of the primary reasons I planted it was for wind control. So most of those shrubs are really not that tall, with the exception of the plums, which I usually prune every year. So elderberry, I didn't really have a lot of experience with them before I planted them here. It's probably been 10 plus years ago. I found they are, whatever it is about our soil and our site, they really like. They grow really well. They produce tons and tons of elderberries. In fact, my family, we can't, if we were to do it just for ourselves, and this would be a 50-foot row is what we have here, basically half the garden length. It will produce hundreds of pounds of elderberries. We just give that away. There's some people in the community that make their own elderberry juice and syrups and that kind of thing, which are quite tasty. My wife has taken some and made some syrups with it. It's really pretty good if you process it correctly and add a little sugar. But it's really healthy for you. You'll find elderberry stuff in Walmart in the pharmacy section, cold and flu, high in vitamin C. I believe the Native community used it to reduce fevers, put it in teas and that kind of thing. So really quite healthy. Plums are just that. They're kind of just a pick and eat type thing. And they are native plum. It's one of the selections. The names escape me right now, but they're a little larger than average for what we consider native plums. They're tasty. They produce most years. I'm a little bit nervous this year that they're going to flower and then we're going to get a frost with the way we're going, but we'll see. They'll survive. Just might not produce fruit. Hedgerows, I don't really do anything with those. I planted those just because they're easy upkeep and they're really hardy. There's a lady in the community that actually harvests the rose hips in the fall after a couple frosts, and I'm assuming she makes tea out of them. So we don't actually do anything with the hedgerows. The aronia berry, those had to be replanted after 2019. Do you remember what 2019 was like? A lot of rain. We had 40 inches of rain in the Huron area that summer. And this part, the northern part of my garden, sits a little bit lower, and those aronia berry that have been there established drowned out. So those are replanted. This will be their third year, and I'm anticipating we get some decent production off of them this year. Buffalo berry is the same thing. Those are regrowing, a little slower to grow. Buffalo berry, I have not found the secret sauce to get them to produce on a regular basis. I really think they like horrible weather, because it seems like the worse the weather is, whether we're really dry or windy or whatever, they seem to produce fruit. If we have those average precipitation years where everything else in the garden is loving it, they seem to not produce fruit for me. So if anyone has a secret sauce for that, I see a hand up.
Well, the buffalo berry are also very good at nitrogen fixing.
Yes.
That helps out. But you have to be sure you have enough male and female.
Okay, that might be, because I bought mine just from the conservation district, and I just planted whatever they gave me. So
Yeah, they usually only sell males.
Okay, so they do produce fruit, but not consistently.
Sometimes one of the males will turn,
Switch?
but you never know. And so I'm thinking they must be all males.
Okay, that's a good pointer. I did not know that. Thanks. There we go. I learned something today too. Okay, and then the grapes are just a table grape variety. They're just for fun. Those almost never leave the garden. People just walk by and pick, which is great, because I don't really want to have to process them or do anything with them. They're a table variety called Bluebell, and I just got those from the conservation district too. They grow really well. They're almost a weed. I really have to prune those aggressively every year, but they produce pretty consistently, and I've never really had any disease issues with them. So that's what my garden looks like, and we do have some apple trees as well. Those are they're probably about 10 years now. So they're really, last year, 2 years ago was our first year we had really good production, and last year we did too. Okay, now I'm gonna show you some real pictures. I gave this presentation, or one very similar to it, to the Master Gardeners Group in Sioux Falls here, I think 3 years ago. Large crowd is at Augustana University. I think there was 4 and some people in the audience. When I showed this photo of what my garden looks like in the spring, there were audible gasps in the crowd. I think they might have almost got up and walked out, but they stuck around and listened. So this is a picture of what my garden looks like. This isn't from this year, although it would pretty much look like this right now if I took the picture. But this is the cover crop area. Like 25% of my garden I plant to a full season cover crop. I have 16 species of cover crops in that mix. And what I do is I broadcast that with just a little hand broadcaster, and then I cover it with a light layer of compost. And that's how I get the cover crop established and growing. Once I broadcast that and cover it with compost, I don't do anything with that area for the rest of the year. It takes off, it gets ahead of any of the weeds that would ever be there, and it really grows. It produces a ton of biomass. I've got several legumes in there, clovers, cowpeas, vetches, lots of things that are fixing nitrogen for me. And I just let it grow all year. What you're seeing here, which is most of the biomass, is pearl millet. And it's actually a small percentage. It's only about 10% of the mix. But as it goes through those stages of the different plants, later on in the summer, that pearl millet, it really likes the heat and it just takes off. And it'll be, I'm not a real tall guy, but it'll be taller than me, easily by the time we get to the end of August. It produces a lot of biomass, which is really what I'm looking for ground cover, and is crucial to my production system, which is what you'll see next. Okay, this is the area I have my tomatoes and eggplants and peppers and some other greens. And what I do is I have a biodegradable plastic that I lay down on top of some drip irrigation. And then I plant my tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, etc. into there. The cans in old pots, basically that's just for a little bit of protection when they're young seedlings. There's no other reason other than that. Just provides them a little bit of protection. Because even with my shrubs that I have around here, and you can see the elderberries right there, we get some of those dry, hot days before they're fully leafed out. You'll get just some damage potential on those small seedlings. So just a little protection to begin with, that's the only reason. And then what I do is you can see all this ground cover here, which looks like a grass, which it is. It's annual ryegrass and clover. So I broadcast that on there right away in the spring. And that acts as my ground cover and soil building throughout the year as well. All right, so this is that cover crop area, same section. What I do is I take our churches, we have a large deck mower that mows the rest of our church property. And I go in there, I raise the deck as high as I can get it. And my first pass, I just drive back and forth on there with the deck high and the blades off. So I'm just kind of knocking things down. The next pass, I'll leave the deck height the same height and turn the blades on. So it chops just a little bit. And then I'll lower it half again. But even then, it's still probably this high off the ground with the blades on. And so I'm kind of chopping it into a mulch, and it forms just a pretty thick blanket that's usually 4 to 6 inches deep of that mulch. And that's my ground cover and weed control for that area of the garden that year. And you'll see that coming here forward. This is my sweet corn area. And you'll see what I use for covering my sweet corn and weed control. Does that look familiar to anyone? It's basically just weed fabric, like the conservation districts use when they plant shelter belts. I actually purchased it from them. And I have reused this. This will be the 15th year I've used the same exact fabric. So what we do is in the spring, we clean that area out. My kids go in there and they chop all of the corn stalks, just real close to ground level. And we use garden staples. We pull the staples, we lift up a section of fabric, we move it over to the next area. 2 people at the end hold it tight, and the other 2 people take the staples and just go right along. And that's what holds it down. And then we plant into those little holes. Okay, so I wish I would have done these holes differently. What I did is I took a box cutter and just made an X the first year we did it. So that was a lot of work, to create those holes. A year or 2 ago when I was giving this presentation, a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, there's a better way to do that. So I was complaining, you can see how how they fray. The holes just get a little bit bigger each and every year, which gives the opportunity for some weeds to maybe come through that we have to weed a little bit. What he did is he took a little propane torch and just melted small holes all throughout it. So that would have been a lot quicker, a lot easier, and a lot easier on the back to do. So if you're gonna do that, I would recommend doing that. You can see this is an area that has the ground staple in there. And those will last years and years. They'll eventually rust out. When they rust out too much to get pushed back in, we just recycle them and I'll purchase another box again. All right, so this is us in the spring. This is from several years ago. So this would be like a year or two after we had just planted the shrubs. Those shrubs are all pretty mature by now. This is what we do. We spend a good chunk of a Saturday cleaning up the garden, moving the fabric around, spreading the cover crop and the compost. And so really, it's really kind of one heavy day of work. And after that, the work is pretty light throughout the rest of the year. So you see we're cleaning up the corn stalks. I'm gonna move the fabric here pretty soon. You can see this is the drip irrigation that I have run. So it's very efficient drip irrigation. I can run that just about any time of day because it's under the fabric or under cover. So really 0 to very little moisture loss through evaporation. This is kind of what the surface of the soil looks like. You can see how it's nice and crumbly. I usually have a lot of cover that's on it, even if it's not in the area that had the cover crop the year before. All right, so I'm going to go through a sequence of what a typical year looks like. And so this here in the foreground is the cover crop, and you can see there's all different types of plants in here. You'll get some things that'll germinate really quickly, like the oats, the annual ryegrass, and some of the clovers. So they'll grow, and then it'll get a little too hot for them, or they'll produce their seed, or just be done growing, and then something else will take over that likes it hot and it starts to grow taller. So you'll see a lot of this is the oats. You see you got some sunflowers that are starting to poke through there. And then if you're really close up, you can see that the millet is starting to poke through too as the summer gets hotter. This is that corn area, what it looks like early on. So that looks pretty tough, doesn't it? That does not look like an even stand. So this was taken in 2022, and that was the year I had 2 derecho throw through. The first one was in early or mid-May. It didn't really affect the garden too much. The one that came through on the 5th of July really did a number on my shrub rolls weren't quite enough to stop 100-mile-an-hour wind. So it really kind of bent over a lot of my corn and even broke off some of it. But I was fortunate that I had planted the corn a little bit late that year because it was kind of wet in the spring. And so my corn was at the stage that even though it got broke off, it was still, the growing point was below that. So a lot of it did come back. And you'll see a picture from later on in the year, the corn fully recovered. All right, this is a photo. I'm mainly trying to show you my ground cover between the rows of tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, etc. So this is annual ryegrass, and it's got some clover in there. And this will be earlier on in the summer. You can see it's a nice cover, stays nice and green. It does not get any supplemental irrigation because my drip irrigation only runs under this biodegradable fabric that's right there. So the cover crop is kind of it's got a survival of the fittest. It's got to fend for itself. If we have a good rain year, it'll grow and be really lush and green to the point where I'll mow it if it gets too tall, just to compete with my plants that I'm producing vegetables on. Or if we don't have as much rain, it'll kind of cover because I planted early in the spring, and then just won't do very much, or it'll even go dormant. Okay, this is a sequence of the cover crop area and kind of how it grows. So you see it's a little taller than the previous photo that I showed you of it. Color again. Getting quite productive. You can see there's flowering. If you look closely, you'd see there's a lot of buckwheat that's flowering within this mixture. Buckwheat is quick to grow, quick to flower. It's also something that makes phosphorus more available to our plants the following year. It has its root exudates are a little bit acidic, so it breaks down that phosphorus and makes it available for the next year's crop. And the pollinators really love their flowers as well. Okay, this is, you can see the cover crop area, the ground cover. It's getting just to the stage right before I would mow it. And I believe I actually did mow it right after I took this picture. You can see the annual ryegrass well. Here in the foreground, you can see some clover that really got ahead of the annual ryegrass and grew. So it's a mixture of annual ryegrass and clover. All right, this is just a fun picture. This is my daughter's hand. Okay, so for those of you that have seen this presentation, don't say anything, but who knows what this caterpillar is? Has someone, sorry? Good guess. It is, it's the swallowtail. Okay, so a lot of people will mistake this for a tomato hornworm because they look very similar. So you'll notice what kind of plant it is on and feeding on. It's a weed. It's purslane. We call it a weed. It's actually edible. This is one of all the weeds that I would have in my garden. I don't have very much trouble with weeds just because I always have ground cover or something else growing. But this is one that I have, probably most of it's purslane because it's really low growing. It'd be below that mower blade in the area that I would mow between those rows of tomatoes and eggplants, for example. But I don't try and control it really at all because it's not too aggressive. And it's really, I found to be one of the primary food sources for the swallowtail butterfly.
Does that have the yellow flower on
The purslane?
Yeah. Weed?
No, it does have a little small flower on it, but I don't think it's yellow. I think it's more whitish.
There's a lot of different varieties that flower different colors.
Okay, there could be, yeah. Mine
Some
are,
of the stems are like red.
yeah, those would be, those are really quite succulent. Like they'll get, if we have a lot of rainfall, they'll almost get as thick as my pinky, the first one I have. Okay, so this is that sweet corn area. Remember from earlier in the earlier photo where it looked really beat up? So it took off and grew again. It didn't produce corn until later in the year. But I'm showing you this for a reason, not just because I'm bragging about how good my sweet corn looks, but I have quite a bit of spacing between rows and then within row for my plants. So most people would plant their sweet corn a lot closer together if they wanted to maximize production. But that's also if you're going to supplement with a lot of irrigation and a lot of fertilizer. So I have mine spaced a little further, and there's two reasons I do it. One is that it provides a little drought hardiness, so I don't have to water a whole lot to produce, because with greater plant spacing, they have more root space to access more of that profile, so they're not competing as much. So in a dry year, they have a little more space to grow. And also when you provide, especially some of the older or the heritage varieties with more space, they will express themselves differently than we're used to with our traditional corn with that single stalk and 2 ears of corn. What will happen is they will produce the main stalk in the center and then 2 sister stalks on the sides. The main stalk in the center will always produce the largest 2 ears of corn, and they'll produce corn usually a week or two before those two sister stalks will produce corn. So I've got 3 arrows that are red. Here's a stalk, here's a stalk, here's a stalk from the same plant. And I've got 6 arrows that are this purplish pink color that are showing ears. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ears of corn on one plant. So on a good precipitation year or an average precipitation year, I'll get 6 ears of corn per plant. 2 nice large ears that you would buy from a guy with the pickup at the corner of wherever that sells local sweet corn, and 4 smaller ears that are still edible and taste fine, they're just not as big. So that's just something that you'll see expressed in some of those older varieties, and some of the newer varieties as well if you give them the space to grow. Okay, here's as we get further on into the year, you see that cover crop area is really growing, right? We've got sunflowers, we've got a lot of the pearl millet that's really starting to take off. It's really starting to produce. It's almost a jungle. My dog loves it in there. So then you also see the tomatoes that are growing right next to the cover crop area, literally right next to it with very little competition or yield loss. And then we've got the cover crop area growing in between. There you can see how close the tomatoes are growing to the cover crop, and they do quite well. This is the squash and melon area. So that squash and melon area always goes into the area that the cover crop was planted the year before. So that's my ground and weed control, because those melons, they really start to grow aggressively and cover a lot of ground later on in the year, but there's a lot of open ground. You can get really quite weedy in there, especially with like the foxtails and some of the water lamp and that kind of thing, that will take over in there. But if you have a lot of ground cover like I do, we have very little weeds that are in there. That's just a picture of my son. What I'm trying to show here is you'll notice how this biodegradable plastic starts to get brittle and crack and break up after it's been on the ground for a good chunk of the year. It's not a perfect situation. It is biodegradable, but it takes more than the 12 months, they say, to really kind of make it all digest and go away. Okay, this is what I've got a microscope I can take some pictures with, and so this is from my cover crop area in the garden. So I'm showing you these small little hairs here are that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi attached to the plant root. This is the rhizobium from a legume, so that's the nitrogen fixing structure that's associated with the bacteria on those legume roots. So that's what's producing the nitrogen for those legumes, like beans, anything in that family. Here's the picture of some earthworm middens. So I have really quite sandy soil, not quite as sandy as Forestburg, but it's definitely gritty. A lot of people will say you won't find earthworms in sand because it's too rough, but I have a large earthworm population. So I think if you give them the habitat to grow or to come, they will show up. This is for the kind of some of the soil nerds that are out there. This is kind of the proof in the pudding for why I manage my garden the way I do. This side is the very first year that we took soil tests and had a garden out there. Keep in mind, this was just an old hay field that was hayed whenever it could be, as much as often as possible. So no fertility was added. It was just kind of old grass hay. So that was what it was like when we first came in. And this is the test from last year. So I'm going to highlight a few areas. First year, we had a soil organic matter percentage of 1.7%. Last year, we moved that up towards 6%. That's a huge increase over the course of about 13 years. 6% soil organic matter in a sandy soil is quite high. And it's also the reason why I never have to apply any commercial fertilizer. I don't use any herbicides, pesticides, insecticides, any of that stuff either. The only thing I will use for anything that's remotely close to a herbicide is if I have a weed escape, which if it does happen, will happen in my melon or squash area, if I have some bare areas that got blown around or moved around. And then I will use basically just commercial grade vinegar. And it will burn down those plants. It doesn't always kill them the first try, but if they start regrowing and you hit them right away again, they'll usually die with that vinegar. It's not the cheapest option, and it's not one I have to do very regularly, but I will use it. I would rather do that than have to till it or go out there with a hoe and scratch around. So soil organic matter is quite high. This is the phosphorus, parts per million. 3 is really low. That would be if you were a producer in South Dakota and you saw 3 parts per million phosphorus, it would be a huge warning flag that you need to apply some commercial phosphorus to produce. But on a sandy soil, you're typically going to have lower than normal phosphorus levels. And you can see now it's, as of last year, it's at 18.9. So, yes.
Where can you get your soil tested? Are there labs?
Yep, and I test this to this, I send mine to the same lab that most of our farmers and ranchers would send it to.
Say that again.
You can send it to any commercial lab and they'll give you these tests. So I sent mine, there's a lab in Alpena. You can also, I think there's a lab in Sioux Falls.
The lab in Sioux Falls that I used to take back to closed. Is there another one that's there?
So I'm trying to think of one that, around here, a lot of producers probably send it to, I guess, the ward labs. I don't know, where do you see this?
Midwest labs.
Midwest could be another one. Ag Vice would be more in the northeastern part of South Dakota towards Fargo. But any of the commercial labs will test your soil. And you can even tell them that it's for a garden. They might give you recommendations. So, yep, this isn't a special lab or anything. It's just the commercial lab that's in Alpena. It's close to Huron. So, phosphorus is now at 18.9 parts per million, which is high. So I said I don't apply any commercial fertilizer, but what am I applying that would really kind of count as fertilizer?
Manure?
Good guess. What am I broadcasting over top of my cover crop seed?
Compost.
Compost. Compost is almost the perfect type of fertilizer. The city of Huron produces compost and it's of a high quality. What I will tell you is a lot of communities around South Dakota aren't composting their ag waste, or their waste departments are. But you need to be careful and you need to ask for a test before you purchase it and use it in your garden. And why do I say that?
You know what?
Chemicals and herbicides, right. So the city of Huron, you can go there and if you're a resident, you can load a pickup load for practically free. As long as you're willing to load it yourself. And they'll send you to a pile and you'll collect from that pile. When you come back with that pile, they will give you the test from that pile. I think I have a picture of them coming up here soon. Yeah, so we'll talk about compost here in a second. Potassium levels were 175, and now you can see they're at 612, which is very high. So just because something says high on there for nutrient doesn't mean it's good. Sometimes you can get too high. Phosphorus and calcium are two of those. You're not typically going to see those as really high levels, but if you were to have really high levels of phosphorus or really high levels of calcium, they can be antagonistic towards each other. So if you have high calcium in the soil, it can actually prevent or reduce the uptake of phosphorus to your plants. So you could have high levels of both, and then you could show phosphorus deficiency in your leaves. It's not because you don't have enough of it in the profile, it's because you have too much of one that's preventing the uptake of another. So those are things that a lab can help you with, for example. Like if you send in with your soil sample and say, I'm having these symptoms with my tomato plants. Oftentimes they will do your result and they'll leave in the notes that it might be because this is too high or this is too low. So yes, I encourage testing. I test my soils every single year for two reasons. One, so I can present it and get that information out. And the other one, just so I know how my soils are doing that particular year.
So what's your opinion on these home soil testing then? Is that not good?
No, they're okay. They're not gonna be as accurate as this. These tests are relatively cheap if you're just asking for the basic one. It can be as cheap as $30. If you're asking for a really extensive one like I do, it can be upwards of $75. So yes, there is a cost to it. And then my pH started out on the higher side, 7.9, and now we're right in that sweet spot of 6.8. I say that's a sweet spot because if you're too basic or you have too high of a pH, it's going to prevent nutrient uptake. If you're too low, it's going to prevent nutrient uptake of different types of nutrients as well. 6.8 is very slightly acidic, but it's right in the sweet spot of where there's not going to be any of those nutrients that are going to be held by the soil not made available. So right around that neutral point which is a 7 to slightly below is kind of the sweet spot. But usually if you're in the 7s, you're probably not going to have much really inhibiting nutrient uptake. This is another soil analysis. We won't spend a lot of time on this. This is one that I helped Cedar Creek Gardens with. They have been having showing some deficiencies in their phosphorus uptake in their plants. And their reason behind that was exactly what the example I gave you is because their calcium levels were really high. They had used a lot of composted manure, just because they also had livestock. And so over the years, they've been adding that year after year after year. So they have really high levels of phosphorus as well as calcium. So really what my recommendation to them was basically stop applying the manure because you have to let those levels decrease. So you're stopping to show that deficiency. All right, so the compost, what I will tell you is that make sure you request a test if you're getting it from your city. And it will tell you, or it will show you the main chemicals on there that could potentially be there. The ones you really want to look for are 2,4-D and dicamba. Those are going to be the most common ones because all the lawn companies, you see them spraying either your lawn or your neighbor's lawn on a regular basis. Most of what they're spraying is broadleaf, which is probably some form of 2,4-D or dicamba. It's great for killing dandelions, although it's becoming less effective because they're getting resilient to it. But some of those can really hang on in those residues and even make it through the composting process. So I know I'm really kind of bragging on Huron with their quality of their compost, but they do a really good job. Very rarely will you see any of the chemicals. It'll come back from the test as not detected at all, or it will be much below the allowable limit. That would negatively affect plant growth. But you'll also want to look at sometimes heavy metals. Those can be in there as well. I've never had those be anywhere near levels that you'd be concerned about, but most of those tests, if they're tested or compost, it will have a whole report for you. All right, so soil health practices also, so I should back up with the compost topic. So compost is how I cheat, and that's how I integrate my livestock. Because the compost that's used in Huron comes from yard waste, tree companies when they chip trees, and then also the turkey plant, all the processing that they cannot use goes there and then composted. So it has lots of animal fats in it, so it's really high quality in Huron. In fact, it's so high quality that a couple of the local farmers caught on a few years ago, and they bought all the compost and took out truckload upon truckload upon truckload of it to apply to their fields. It sounds like a great thing, but they really kind of peeved off a lot of the gardeners in town, because there was none. And I went there that spring, I said, I'm here for a truckload of compost, and I knew I'd done it year after year after year, and she said, sorry, we're out. And I thought, man, you guys always have mountains of this stuff. I'm like, oh, do you mean like it's not done, or I need to come back next week? And she's like, no, we're out. We won't have any until probably late August. So then I found out the local farmer had bought like 78 semi-loads full. But you could buy it for pennies on the dollar for what the going rate for nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer was. It was smart for them. I'm sure they grew great crops. But now they always keep back 2 piles for the people of the city. So all these soil health practices apply to the landscape as well. This is a picture of my house. I've got 90% of what I have in there is native plant. Even my yard is buffalo grass, not Kentucky bluegrass. So this is all native plant community for the most part. And I'm going to show you 2 years. This is 2019. Keep in mind we had 40 inches of precipitation that summer, so very wet. Sump pumps always running in the house. This is 2021, which is a drought year. Okay, the reason I'm showing these two right back to back, we'll go back and forth. Very little difference. Okay, the native plant community is always going to survive. I've got years, it's obvious this year it's more lush, maybe a little bit taller. But this 2021 was a very dry year for us. Very little precipitation all year, just missed the Huron area all the time. And you can see everything is doing quite well. The only thing that wouldn't be native would be my maple right there. And that doesn't even stand there anymore because it got blown down in 2022. So yeah, native landscaping, I love it. It's less work. I never have to water my lawn. My water bill is virtually nil. The only water that gets put out would be in my garden area with drip irrigation. Never have to water my native plants. Never have to fertilize any of my yard. It's all native. Actually, fertilizer will eventually impede production of the native plant community because it doesn't like that type of nitrogen uptake, for example. These are just some fun pictures. I've got milkweed, and I actually just went and got a milkweed pod from along the road ditch, and we just spread that seed one spring. So that's where that came from. It's free. So yeah, that's milkweed, and there's your monarch caterpillar, for whoever said that earlier. There's a native bumblebee, and this is a trickier one. Anyone know what this plant is? It's a native, more common along the far eastern part of the state. Good guess. No. It has a similar flower structure, though. Nope. Lots of good guesses. It's not very common, and you're only going to find this at native landscape centers, or even your conservation district, I think, can order them. It's called Culver's root. It likes it in a little wetter area, so I have this down by my curb, which gets a little extra moisture from the sump pump water running all the time. So this is Culver's root. Does well in a little wetter than normal areas. Produces this really neat looking white spiky flower late in the summer, usually late August into September. So when not a lot of other things are necessarily blooming, it's blooming. And bumblebees will just be fighting each other for it. So it's just kind of a fun plant, and it looks just it's a little different looking than a lot of our other landscape plants. And then of course I've got my zinnia section just because I like zinnias for a couple hours. But this is the black phase of the swallowtail. This is probably my favorite butterfly in the world. So I like the yellow ones too, but I think the black ones are really neat. All right, so comments or questions? These are my 3 kids. In order, it's my son Luke, he's the youngest. The middle one is my daughter Josie, she's a sophomore in high school, and the one on the end, the blonde, is the middle child, and she is a freshman in high school. So, all right, any questions? I can turn the lights on too.
Getting back to integrating livestock.
Yep.
Would you just use regular manure then? As my gardens are all raised. And so what would you do that?
So I
How
would,
would you do that?
I like the use of manure, but I would encourage you to get it tested before you apply it. And I would also encourage you to buy, I would just call it aged manure, or something that's been let sit in the lot or sit out in the open for a year or 2 or more. Manure is a great source of fertilizer, but if you're applying it fresh and you apply it at too high amounts, it can also have higher levels of salts in it, which can inhibit plant growth. It also can be higher in phosphorus, which is good. We want phosphorus in our soils, but we don't want too much for the reason I gave you. It can inhibit the uptake of sometimes other nutrients. So just get it tested, and you can often send those manure samples. A lot of the soil testing labs also do manure sampling. Not all of them, so you'd want to call beforehand. But if you don't want to get it tested, just make sure it's been aged or been sitting out in a lot or sitting out in the open for a couple of years. And essentially then it'll just be
And
composted.
then also in conjunction with that, is it better to buy it from, at a commercial place or go out to the farm and dig it out of the livestock where that livestock is?
You could use the one where the livestock is. What I will caution you with that is that it can be a source of weed seeds. So you're almost certainly going to bring weeds into your garden if you just get it from the lot from someplace. So you would need to be aware of that. You can buy it, like we've got, I don't know what you have down here for like farm stores, but we've got like Runnings up in Huron. And they'll sell bags of composted dairy manure. And that stuff, it'll have all the nutrient analysis on there for you. So that might be the way to go. It'd be easier to access, easier to haul around, and a lot less likely to have weed seeds in there. And then you wouldn't have to pay to have it tested.
And then the bag stuff has to be sterilized.
Yeah, and the bag stuff, yes, usually by state law, I think it has to be sterilized in order for it to be sold in South Dakota. Yeah, it usually is sterilized or composted, thermal composted, so it would have killed any weed seeds that are there.
Okay, what about mushroom compost? We have a greenhouse in the park and that has gorgeous plants and we
Yep.
use mushroom compost.
Yep, mushroom compost is fantastic if you can find it. Yeah, so if they are selling it, I would encourage you to use that. It's very safe to use. Almost never has salt in it. There is a nutrient that it can be high in, but it's escaping me which one it is right now. It might be potassium, but I'm not sure. But they would know if you're buying from them, they would probably know. Yeah, mushroom compost is great, it's just hard to come by.
Oh, it's seminars and
Yes, we have.
different ones, but this one here is a greenhouse outside of town that has it.
That'd be a good one. I'm a big fan of compost, you can't tell. Yep.
Do you disturb the soil or you just lay it
Nope, I
on?
just broadcast it on there, and I broadcast it about as thin as I can spread it and still cover the whole soil surface. So it's at the thickest, probably a 1/4 inch. And I do that very thin because I'm trying to manage, if you remember that one month, my potassium levels are getting high. It's probably because it is because my compost source has higher levels of potassium. So I'm trying to minimize that accumulation of that. I'm just trying to get it enough to cover the seeds and cover the soil during that cover crop.
What about grass clippings?
Yep, grass clippings are fine too. In fact, before I found the city as a source of compost, I used grass clippings. Yep, from my own yard or from a neighbor that I knew didn't use any chemicals. Otherwise, if you're spreading yard clippings from a neighbor that has 2,4-D spread all over it, and it's gonna grow, or it's gonna look sick.
My potatoes are really big.
Yep. Grass clippings are great. I use them as well.
What kind of seed grass do you have in your yard then that's native?
Buffalo, the long grass?
Yeah.
Buffalo grass.
To your whole yard?
Yep.
Could we, I had that, would it take over?
Yes, so it's slower to establish, so that first year might be frustrating for you unless you have perfect growing conditions. So that's kind of a fuzzy picture of it. So you can see my lawn is right there. That's buffalo grass. It's a lighter green than your Kentucky bluegrass, but it's really kind of a neat looking, I like the color. It looks different than my neighbors. It does not, the thing that some people may not like about it, it does not green up usually until about Memorial Day. So my neighbors usually been mowing their lawn for a month or better before mine is even green. So that, and also, yes, basically once you get to Labor Day, it will stop growing. It will stay green, but it will stop growing. And then once you say the word frost, it's done. But it's very deep rooted. Mine will stay green. I have never had it really go dormant even on the driest of years. It will slow down in growth. And I do mow mine, so the fallacy that you don't have to mow it is not true. If you have really hot weather and moisture, it will grow just as fast as your neighbor's lawn. It's really quite thick. It's a nice carpet. It's soft. I think it's just fine. You can walk barefoot on it. Just like any other. It takes traffic. I've got 3 kids running around. You can take that traffic just as well as anything. So I didn't quite show it as well, but yeah, it's you can buy it from. It's not common. I think I bought mine out of Nebraska, and there are varieties that are better for lawns. I think it was stock seed out of Nebraska, I think. And there's different varieties that are better for lawn. They're a little thicker and will germinate. They'll treat the seeds so it will germinate better. It's slower to establish, so I will caution that. And a lot less more.
But can you just overseed what you have, or do you have to take up your?
You would have to start over. It will not compete because like Kentucky bluegrass will be green and growing.
Okay.
Long before this would even germinate.
Okay, my question is, I don't have raised gardens. Do I stir up that soil or leave it, don't touch it?
Raised gardens, I don't think I have a picture in here of, no, I don't. So I built a raised area in the front. It's kind of behind the taller grass that my wife just grows herbs and stuff in there, and it's a little taller. We filled it with compost. We just plant right into there every year, and maybe I'll top it off with a little bit of compost that it settles each year.
But you don't?
They never stir it up. Well, we'll dig in, like if we have seedlings, we'll dig in on seedlings, and that's it.
Another question on a different topic.
Yep.
What do you do with the critters? Do you have any problem? I mean, Sioux Falls, my daughter-in-law has problems with the squirrels and rabbits eating her flowers and her garden.
Yeah, so I don't have problems with rabbits where I am, but we do have, on our church area, we have problems with ground squirrels. So that's also part of the reason I put those little containers over my seedlings, like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, because they're too tall for those ground squirrels to get into. So then by the time the plant is growing tall enough.
Yes, I think the monsters in the rabbits
I don't have a good solution for rabbits.
We used for ground squirrels, they were coming under our garden shed. We used Irish spray soap. Irish spray.
We do have you.
And stuck it in holes and
Not
they
regular.
left.
You compost with wood chips?
Sure.
You build a compost pile with wood chips?
So I do,
You have to be smart.
you can use wood chips as long as you have enough green material in there to get the compost action started.